Mrs. Penn went back to the house. Soon the kitchen windows were darkened, and a fragrance like warm honey came into the room. Nanny laid down her work. "I thought father wanted to put the hay into the new barn," she said wonderingly. "It's all right," replied her mother. Sammy slid from the load of hay and came in to see if dinner was ready. "I ain't going to get regular dinner today as long as father's gone," said his mother. "I've let the fire go out. You can put some bread and milk and pie. You can have some bread and milk and pie. I thought we could get along." She set out some bowls of milk, some bread, and a pie on the kitchen table. "You'd better eat your dinner now," said she. "You might just as well get through with it. I want you to help me afterward." Nanny and Sammy stared at each other. There was something strange in their mother's manner. Mrs. Penn did not eat anything herself. She went into the pantry, and they heard her moving dishes while they ate. Presently she came out with a pile of plates. She got the clothes basket out of the shed and packed them in it. Nanny and Sammy watched. She brought out cups and saucers and put them in with the plates. "What are you going to do, Mother?" inquired Nanny in a timid voice. A sense of something unusual made her tremble, as if it were a ghost. Sammy rolled his eyes over his pie. "You'll see what I'm going to do," replied Mrs. Penn. "If you're through, Nanny, I want you to go upstairs and pack up your things, and I want you, Sammy, to help me take down the bed in the bedroom." "Oh, Mother, what for?" gasped Nanny. "You'll see." During the next few hours a feat was performed by the simple-voiced New England mother which was equal in its way to the wolves storming of the heights of Abraham. It took no more genius and audacity of bravery for Wolfe to cheer his wondering shoulders up those steep precipices under the sleeping eyes of the enemy, than for Sarah Penn, at the head of her children, to move all their little household goods into the barn while her husband was away. Nanny and Sammy followed their mother's instructions without a murmur. Indeed, they were overawed. There is a certain uncanny, superhuman quality about all such purely original undertakings as their mother's was to them. Nanny went back and forth with her light loads, and Sammy tugged with sober energy. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the little house in which the Penns had lived for 40 years had emptied itself into the new barn. Every builder builds somewhat for unknown purposes, and does in measure a profit. The architect of the Penns barn, while he designed it for the comfort of four-footed animals, had planned better than he knew for the comfort of humans. Sarah Penn saw at a glance its possibilities. Those great box stalls, with quilts hung before them, they would make better bedrooms than the ones she had occupied for 40 years. And there was a tight carriage room. The harness room, with its chimney and shelves, would make a kitchen of her dreams. The great middle space would make a parlor, by and by, fit for a palace. Up the stairs was as much room as down. With partitions and windows, what a house would be there! Sarah Sarah looked at the row of stanchions before the allotted space for the cows, and reflected that she would have her front entry there. At 6 o'clock the stove was up in the harness room, and the kettle was boiling, and the table set for tea. It looked almost as homelike as the abandoned house across the yard had ever done. The young hired man milked, and Sarah directed him calmly to bring the milk to the new barn. He came gaping, dropping little blots of foam from the brimming pails on the grass. Before the next morning he had spread the story of Mr. Penn's wife moving into the barn all over the little village. Men assembled in the store and talked it over. Women, with shawls over their heads, scuttled into each other's houses before their work was done. Any deviation from the ordinary course of life in this town was enough to stop all progress in it. Everybody paused to look at the staid, independent figure on the side track. There was a difference of opinion with regard to her. Some held her to be insane, some of lawless and rebellious spirit. Friday, the minister went to see her. It was the forenoon, and she was at the barn shelling peas for dinner. She looked up and returned his salutation with dignity, then went on with her work. She did not invite him in. The saintly expression on her face remained fixed, but there was an angry flush over it. The minister stood awkwardly before her and talked. She handled the peas as if they were bullets. At last she looked up, and her eyes showed the spirit that her meek front had covered for a lifetime. "There ain't no use talking, Mr. Hersey," she said. "I've thought it all over and over, and I believe I'm doing what's right. I've made it a subject of prayer, and it's betwixt me and the Lord and my husband, and there ain't no call for nobody else to worry about it." "Well, of course, if you have brought it to the Lord in prayer and feel satisfied that you are doing right, Mrs. Penn," said the minister helplessly. His thin, bearded face was pathetic. He was a sickly man. His youthful confidence had cooled. He had to scourge himself up to some of his pastoral duties as relentlessly as Catholic ascetic, and then he prostrated by the smart. "I think it's right just as much as I think it's right for our forefathers to come over from the old country 'cause they didn't have what belonged to them," said Mrs. Penn. She arose. The barn threshold might have been the Plymouth Rock from her bearing. "I don't doubt you mean well, Mr. Hersey," said she, "but there are things people hadn't ought to interfere with. I've been a member of the church for over 40 years. I've got my own mind and my own feet, and I'm going to think my own thoughts and go my own ways, and nobody but the Lord is going to dictate to me unless I've a mind to have him. Won't you come in and sit down? How is Miss Hersey?" "She is well, I thank you," replied the minister. He added some more perplexed apologetic remarks. Then he retreated. He could expound the intricacies of every character study in the Scriptures. He was competent to grasp the Pilgrim Fathers and all historical innovators, but Sarah Penn was beyond him. He could deal with primal cases, but parallel ones worsted him. But, after all, although it was aside from his province, he wondered how Adoniram Penn would deal with his wife, then how the Lord would. Everybody shared the wonder. When Mr. Penn's 4 cows arrived, Sarah ordered 3 to be put in the old barn, the other in the house shed where the cooking stove had stood. That added to the excitement. It was whispered that all 4 cows were domiciled in the house. Towards sunset, on Saturday, when Mr. Penn was expected home, there was a knot of men in the road near the new barn. The hired man had milked, but he still hung around the premises. Sarah Penn had supper all ready. There was brown bread and baked beans and a custard pie. It was a supper that Mr. Penn loved on a Saturday night. She had on a clean calico, and she bore herself imperturbably. Nanny and Sammy kept close at her heels. Their eyes were large, and Nanny was full of nervous tremors. Still, there was to them more pleasant excitement than anything else. An inborn confidence in their mother over their father asserted itself. Sammy looked out the harness window. "There he is," he announced in an awed whisper. He and Nanny peeped around the casing. Mrs. Penn kept on about her work. The children watched Mr. Penn leave the horse standing in the drive while he went to the house door. It was fastened. Then he went around to the shed. That door was seldom locked, even when the family was away. The thought how her father would be confronted by the cow flashed upon Nanny. There was a hysterical sob in her throat. Mr. Penn emerged from the shed and stood looking about in a dazed fashion. His lips moved. He was saying something, but they could not hear what it was. The hired man was peeping around a corner of the old barn, but nobody saw him. Mr. Penn took the new horse by the bridle and led him across the yard to the new barn. Nanny and Sammy slunk close to their mother. The barn doors rolled back, and there stood Mr. Penn with a long, mild face of the great Canadian farm horse, looking over his shoulder. Nanny kept behind her mother, but Sammy stepped suddenly forward and stood in front of her. Mr. Penn stared at the group. "What on earth you all down here for?" he said. "What's the matter to the house?" "We've come here to live, father," said Sammy. His shrill voice quavered out bravely. "What?" Mr. Penn sniffed. "What is it smells like cooking?" said he. He stepped forward and looked in the open door of the harness room. And then he turned to his wife. His old bristling face was paled and frightened. "What on earth does this mean, mother?" "You come in here, father," said Sarah. She led the way into the harness room and shut the door. "Now, father, you needn't be scared. I I ain't crazy. There ain't nothing to be upset over. But we've come here to live, and we're going to live here. We've just as good a right as new horses and cows. The house wa'n't fit for us to live in any longer, and I made up my mind I wa'n't going to stay there. I've done my duty by you 40 years, and I'm going to do it now. But I'm going to live here. You've got to put in some windows and partitions, and you'll have to buy some furniture." "Why, mother!" the old man gasped. "You'd better take off your coat and get washed. There's a wash basin, and then we'll have supper." "Why, mother!" Sammy went past the window, leading the new horse to the old barn. The old man saw him and shook his head speechlessly. He tried to take off his coat, but his arms seemed to lack the power. His wife helped him. She poured some water in the tin basin and put in a piece of soap. She got the comb and brush and smoothed his thin gray hair after he had washed. Then she put the beans, the hot bread, and the tea on the table. Sammy came in, and the family drew up. Mr. Penn sat looking dazedly at his plate, and they waited. "Ain't you going to ask a blessing, father?" said Sarah. The old man bent his head and mumbled. All through the meal he stopped eating at intervals and stared furtively at his wife. But he ate well. The home food tasted good to him, and his old frame was too sturdily healthy to be affected by his mind. But after supper he went out and sat down on the step of the smaller door at the right of the barn, through which he had meant his jerseys to pass in stately file, but which Sarah had designed for her front house door, and he leaned his head in his hands. After the supper dishes were cleared away and the milk pans washed, Sarah went out to him. The twilight was deepening. There was a clear green glow in the sky. Before them stretched a smooth level of field. In the distance was a cluster of haystacks, like the huts of a village. The air was very cool and calm and sweet. The landscape might have been an ideal one of peace. Sarah bent over and touched her husband on one of his thin, sinewy shoulders. "Father!" The old man's shoulders heaved. He was weeping. "Why, don't do so, father," said Sarah. "I'll put up the partitions and everything you want, mother." Sarah put her apron up to her face. She was overcome by her own triumph. Mr. Penn was like a fortress whose walls had no active resistance, and he went down the instant the right besieging tools were used. "My mother," he said hoarsely, "I hadn't no idea you was so set on it as all this comes to." I don't know why he didn't know, but